We're different political parties. We stand for different things. But where we have common goals, we cannot let our differences stand in the way of delivering what Canadians deserve.
And what we've been able to do is to use our power in this minority government to get help to people, to help to people in this difficult time. And I want you to know, we've got your back.
They've cooked up a backroom deal that would see Justin Trudeau get the majority power that he tried desperately to get last fall in the last election, but he failed to get.
An unprecedented moment of cooperation between political parties, or a power grab by a prime minister who wanted a majority in the last election. This kind of deal has never happened federally before. So what does it change for Canadians and for political strategy? I'm here with the At Issue panel for a special Tuesday edition. Chantal Hebert, Andrew Coyne, and Elamin Abdelmahmoud. Althia is away this week. Chantal, how surprising was this for you?
Well, you can see the logic of it. But I'm assuming, like most people, that no one expected it 6 months in. It's usually the kind of deal that one negotiates going into a new term rather than 6 months in. That does not take away from some of the benefits and the inconvenience of it, because we are early on in a mandate. But it's an interesting, I think, unexpected development.
What does it indicate to you, Andrew? And I'll come back around to you, Chantal, for that too. Like, what does it tell you about how this government wants to move forward, about what the NDP's strategy is?
Well, first of all, it's mostly an agreement to do what they would probably be doing anyway. So does anybody really think that this government was in serious danger of being defeated in the House when they can govern with the support of any one of three opposition parties? Does anybody really think that the policies in here are that hard for the Liberal government to swallow? And it's not even binding, of course, that any one of them can violate at any time they choose, and will if they get up in the polls. What it's mostly, I think, indicative of is the short-term needs of each of the parties. The short-term need, particularly for the NDP, is they don't want an election and they don't want speculation about an election. Any minority parliament is basically an extended game of chicken, not so much between the government and the opposition, but between the different opposition parties. So what happens is the government brings in, let's say, a budget, and one or two of the parties rush to the microphones to be the first to say, we're voting against this budget. Yep. And it leaves the last opposition party looking ill because they have to decide whether or not to bring the government down. The NDP, everybody knows, with their debt situation, cannot stomach an election. They would be the party that would be up for that kind of ritual humiliation over and over and over again. This kind of takes that off the table. So that's what they gain from it. For the Liberals, they get a partner that is going to be quite compliant in terms of committee hearings, et cetera, that ultimately the only thing that Parliament can do to really get its way on things like should the government yield documents to the committee is if they can threaten to bring down the government over it. To the extent that this agreement is binding on the parties, as I say, that's a big if, then the government can rest easier on that. I think in each case, however, it's at their long-term cost. It's going to cost the Liberals to be this closely associated with the NDP, I think, in terms of giving up the centre ground. And it's going to be costly to the NDP because they're giving a bunch of marquee policies that had the NDP stamp on them. Basically, the Liberals are going to take credit for them now. And so longer term, they're going to have a hard time differentiating themselves from the Liberals.
Okay, Elamin, and then I can see Chantal's got more to say too. Elamin.
I mean, these rumors of this agreement have been floating around since at least November, which would have been a more logical time for this to happen, as Chantal pointed out. The fact that it's happening now, I think, is an indication that I'm not really sure what the Liberals get out of this, except for just a little bit more reassurance. The NDP seem to be the clear winners, at least when I look at the marquee promises of this agreement. The idea of a dental care program, the idea of a national pharmacare program, being a bit more formalized commitment. Something that they can then use as a stick in whatever election comes in 2025. That's actually a pretty big agreement for the Liberals to give to the NDP in order to avoid election for the next few years. And in exchange, we get the stability of knowing it's not going to be the next budget or the budget after that knocks down this government, which buys Trudeau a little bit more time to cement whatever legacy he sort of wants to establish.
Chantal?
So the average life of a minority government in this country is 18 to 24 months, and that is never long enough to implement very many policies, only to put them in the window. This stretches it to the normal term of a majority government, true enough. but it does more, and I'm going to walk away from who gains, who loses, and other things. What it does do is give time for policies like childcare, which is a Liberal policy. It used to be an NDP policy until the Liberals took it and tried to make it a reality. Much harder to break down, cancel in 2025 than it would next year. Climate change policies. I'm guessing Stephen Guilbeault, the environment minister, is sitting at home thinking, this is great. Because it shores up his hand. It also makes it harder to undo Liberal policies that the NDP happens to support on climate change to undo in 2025. It allows Justin Trudeau, true enough, to enshrine a legacy, but I think it does give the NDP a chance to say, we serve a purpose. I have a problem with the notion that two parties who together won more than half the votes in the last election, so that's a majority of Canadians, find enough common ground to advance policies, and it's all about game making and game playing. I think given a chance, and I don't know what the future holds, this could actually result in advancing policies that people who voted for the NDP or the Liberals wanted to advance. So maybe not.
Except
maybe
that
it's just a game, but
finish off and then enter.
But just a point to the point that the government knew it could govern without losing the confidence of the House. That would be true until September 10th, until a new Conservative leader is appointed, and then we start playing the game of how long, how much advantage to each, because we might have an election tomorrow.
Right. Okay, Andrew. Yeah.
Well, most of these policies, the Liberals could, if they wanted to, could bring them in anyway. I mean, Stephen Harper managed to govern with a minority, with a hostile minority, hostile parliament, much more hostile from 2008 or 2006 on. And I don't think it'd be terribly difficult for the Liberals to govern through this. I do think, however, the one thing that may be different is we're in for some rocky times. We're in for some rocky times with the foreign affairs issue, with the whole Ukraine, et cetera, but also with the economy, with inflation rising. And so to the extent that this does give them breathing room, to the extent that this actually does encourage people to not pull the plug on the government, then it gives them some breathing room on that they can ride through some unpleasant times on the economy, which we're probably heading for.
So let's just talk about the Conservatives for a moment, who obviously call this a power grab. I wonder what, obviously you can see political advantage to them qualifying it that way. They also are doing things like saying this is an NDP government. Of course it is not. But what is there a benefit or a risk here for the Conservatives as they're in the midst of this leadership race, Elamin?
I have to say that this would be a kind of gift for a contender like Jean Charest when we're looking at someone who would be claiming the ground in the middle. Of course, the thing that the Liberals might be counting on is that it's going to be pretty tough for someone who wants to run on the middle, but somewhere in the center, to actually end up winning the Conservative leadership. So this would be a gift for Pierre Poilievre in the sense that he has a boogeyman, but also it does increase the polarization we have in this country. I mean, if Pierre Poilievre ends up becoming the next leader of the Conservative Party, then we effectively, at least in terms of brand, we don't really have a party that is very proud to occupy the place of the center in that next election. I think that makes it an interesting election for us. But I think short of Jean Charest winning, Justin Trudeau appears to feel no need to sort of defend and occupy a place in the center somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting because that was also cited as one of the reasons that this would help polarization in the country. I think you could also say the opposite. I mean, I don't think we really know how this plays out until we know who the leader is, Chantal.
No, but I do think, regardless of how this pans out, that every year that the Liberals are in power is an extra year that adds to the odds that we will have government change when the next election comes around, because that's how the cycle works. And so why Justin Trudeau doesn't seem to worry? Possibly because by then it's going to be almost a decade, and notwithstanding what he said today, he will probably have nailed down more of a legacy than if he turned down a deal with the NDP.
So is that part of what's guiding all of this or pushing all of this to happen now, do you think, Andrew?
Well, there's certainly a lot of speculation that says by pushing this off, by, again, ostensibly giving themselves 3 or 4 years rather than 1 or 2, that it makes it more likely that Justin Trudeau can ride off into the sunset before the next election without leaving his party in the lurch. If that's the case, then that affects the Conservative calculations to some extent. I couldn't exactly say how, but if you're thinking you're going to be facing somebody other than Justin Trudeau in the next election, that would go factor into your calculations as to who you want to pick. It also means you don't have to have somebody who's up and ready to go at any time in the election, so they can factor that into their calculations. Mostly, it arguably leaves the Liberals exposed on their right flank. It arguably, by associating themselves so closely with the NDP, leaves them vulnerable in the center ground if the Conservatives decide they want to go for that. And the calculation the Liberals may be making is we can steal ground from the NDP by doing this without having to worry too much about our right flank, because the Conservatives will pick a leader who will be not particularly contender for the center ground.
Chantal, quickly, then Elamin. Yeah.
You do realize we're talking about something that would happen in an election 2 to 3 years from now, and we don't have a clue what the environment will be like. I believe, and I tend to be a good customer on stuff like that. I'll take them on faith until they prove otherwise.
Yeah.
I believe stability is in sync with the public mood at this point.
Elamin.
I guess the thing I want to be careful with is just how much to take for granted this NDP support, because it's going to be tested pretty early. The idea that the Liberals are, looking at increasing military spending, that's something that the NDP on principle is not particularly excited about. And so that presents to me an early sort of testing place in terms of what this agreement can do and where this agreement can sort of work or can't work. One thing that the Prime Minister said is that, sure, there are other parties that we can work with on this. But then that raises the question, why do this at all? And I'm still not convinced that the Liberals get that much out of it.
Okay, I got to leave it there. You're going to come back on Thursday. Something else will have happened by then, surely. We'll talk about it all then. Thank you so much. Now let's send things back to Adrienne, and she's in Toronto.